Rain came down so hard that night that the torches along the palace road hissed and spat, and every carriage wheel threw up a curtain of mud as it rushed toward the gates. Elira Bennet was not in one of those carriages. She was running on foot, skirts soaked through, one shoe already lost somewhere behind her in the dark, when she heard the cry. It was not a loud cry. It was thin, almost swallowed by the storm, coming from the ditch beside the garden wall where the grand houses ended and the poorer lanes began. Elira stopped. Behind her, far off, she could still hear the music spilling out of the palace windows, violins climbing over each other, laughter sharp as glass. Every noble family in the kingdom had sent a daughter to that ball tonight, all of them chasing the same prize, the unmarried Duke of Hartley Hall, a man Elira had never once seen and had no wish to. She turned toward the ditch instead. An old woman lay half in the mud, one arm twisted beneath her, a basket of onions scattered around her like fallen stars. Her gray hair had come loose from its pins and stuck to her face in wet ropes. When she saw Elira approaching, she did not call for help. She simply glared, as if being found this way was its own small insult. Elira knelt without thinking twice, ignoring the mud soaking through her only good dress, the dress she had spent 3 weeks stitching by candlelight in hopes it might, just once, get her through the palace doors as a guest instead of a servant's daughter. That hope did not matter now. She pressed 2 fingers gently to the woman's wrist, the way her mother had taught her before the fever took her mother away for good, and felt a pulse, quick but steady. "Can you tell me your name?" Elira asked, raising her voice over the wind. "I can tell you to mind your own affairs," the old woman snapped, though her voice shook with pain, not anger. "Go on. Go chase your duke like the rest of them. I heard the whole road talking about him all week. Go stand in line." "I wasn't going to the ball," Elira said simply, sliding an arm beneath the woman's shoulders. "I was walking home from the dress shop. Now, can you move your ankle, or does it hurt too much to try?" The old woman tried and gasped, and that gasp told Elira everything she needed to know. The ankle was either badly sprained or worse. There was no time to debate it with a stranger's pride. Thunder rolled overhead, close enough that the ground seemed to hum beneath them, and somewhere down the lane a dog began barking at nothing, or at something the darkness was hiding. "I'm going to help you up," Elira said. "It will hurt. I'm sorry for that in advance." "You talk too much for someone doing a kindness," the woman muttered, but she let Elira lift her anyway, let her weight fall against Elira's shoulder as they rose together out of the mud. They made slow progress. The old woman was lighter than she looked, worn thin the way certain trees grow thin in a hard winter, all bark and no give. Every few steps she hissed through her teeth and called Elira a fool for stopping, and every few steps Elira ignored her and kept walking, because stopping now would help no one. The lane back toward the poorer end of town twisted between shuttered shops and leaning fences, and the rain showed no sign of easing. Once, lightning cracked white across the sky, and for half a second Elira saw the old woman's face clearly, lined and proud, her eyes a pale, striking gray that seemed out of place on someone dressed so plainly. Elira thought nothing of it. She was too busy watching the road for loose stones that might turn an already injured ankle worse. "There," the old woman said at last, nodding toward a narrow cottage set back from the lane, its windows dark, its garden overgrown with herbs nobody had trimmed in a long while. "That one is mine." Getting the door open with one hand while holding the old woman upright with the other took longer than Elira would have liked, but at last they were inside, out of the wind, and Elira lowered her carefully into a chair beside a cold hearth. The cottage smelled of dried lavender and old smoke. It was tidy in the way of someone who lived alone and had grown used to needing no one, though tonight, at least, that had not quite been true. "Stay there," Elira said, though the woman had made no move to argue. "I'll find something to build a fire with." "There is no need to fuss." "There is every need," Elira said, already crouched at the hearth, arranging kindling with fingers gone stiff and pale from the cold. "You're soaked through, and so am I, And if I leave you shivering in a wet chair all night, I will feel it on my conscience for a month." That earned something close to a laugh, dry and short, quickly swallowed. "You have a strange way of being kind. Half orders, half apology." My mother used to say the same thing. Elira struck the flint twice before the spark caught, and a small flame licked up along the dry moss she had tucked beneath the wood. She fed it carefully, coaxing it larger, until warmth began to press back against the chill soaking through her dress. She said I never learned to be gentle without also being stubborn. Smart woman. She was. Elira did not say more than that. Some doors, once opened, let in a draft that was hard to close again, and she was not ready to explain her mother, or the years since, to a stranger she had known for only half an hour. She found a blanket folded over the back of a narrow bed in the next room and brought it out, draping it over the old woman's shoulders. She found, too, a jar of salve on a shelf crowded with jars, and knelt again to examine the swollen ankle by firelight, turning it gently this way, and that until she was satisfied nothing was broken, only badly wrenched. "You've done this before," the old woman observed, watching her work. My mother was a healer in a small way. She never had a proper title for it, but half the street came to her when something ached or bled or broke. Elira wrapped a strip of clean cloth snugly around the ankle, not too tight, the way she had watched her mother do 100 times. "I suppose some of it stayed with me." "And your father?" "Gone before I can remember him." Elira said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, and the old woman seemed to respect that plainness enough not to push further. They sat a while in silence after that, the fire crackling, rain still drumming steadily on the roof. The old woman studied Elira with an attention that felt sharper than idle curiosity, the way a jeweler studies a stone before deciding whether it is worth the trouble of cutting. "You could have kept walking," she said eventually. "Half the girls in this town would have, especially tonight of all nights with the whole world chasing after a duke's favor." "I don't much care for the whole world's favor," Elira said, tucking the blanket more securely around the old woman's shoulders. "I cared that someone was hurt in a ditch in the middle of a storm. That seemed like the more urgent matter. And if I told you I had nothing to give you in return for your trouble, no coin, no favor, nothing but an old woman's onions, half of which are probably ruined now." Elira almost smiled at that. "Then I suppose I'll go home with wet shoes and a story to tell no one, and that will be the end of it." The old woman studied her a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind those pale gray eyes, and then she nodded once, as if a decision had been made and settled, though she did not say what that decision was. "What is your name, girl?" Elira Bennett." "Elira," the old woman repeated, testing the shape of it. "I am Agnes. You may call me that and nothing grander, whatever else you might one day hear." It struck Elira as an odd thing to say, whatever else you might one day hear, as though there were things about this small, sharp-tongued woman that Elira had not yet been told and might not like discovering. But the fire was warm now, and the rain was finally beginning to ease outside, and she was too tired from the walk to chase down a stray comment that was probably nothing at all. "It's good to meet you properly, Agnes," she said instead, rising to check the fire once more before she had to leave. "I should go before it gets too late, but I don't like leaving you here alone with that ankle. Is there someone who checks on you?" "There used to be," Agnes said, and something in her voice closed like a door. "Not anymore, not the way there should be." Elira did not press. She banked the fire so it would burn low and steady through the night, left the salve within easy reach of the chair, and promised, without quite planning to, that she would come back tomorrow to see how the ankle was healing. "You don't need to trouble yourself," Agnes said, though she did not sound as though she meant it. "I know I don't need to," Elira said, pulling her damp shawl back over her shoulders. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference." Outside, the storm had softened to a light drizzle, and the palace on the hill still glowed gold through the mist, distant and unreal, like something from a story that belonged to other people. Elira walked home alone through the quiet lanes, her one remaining shoe squelching with every step, and she did not think once about the ball she had missed, or the duke every other girl in the kingdom had spent the evening chasing. She thought instead about the strange, sharp old woman with the pale gray eyes, sitting by a low fire in a cottage that smelled of lavender, and about the odd, unfinished weight of the words she had left hanging in the air. Whatever else you might one day hear. Elira had no way of knowing, walking home cold and soaked and quietly pleased with herself for a night's work well done, that those words would turn out to matter more than anything that had happened inside the palace that evening. She only knew that she had made a promise, and that she intended to keep it, and that for reasons she could not name, she was already looking forward to tomorrow. The following morning came bright and rinsed clean, the kind of sky that follows a hard storm, and Elira woke earlier than she needed to, already thinking of the cottage on the narrow lane. She dressed quickly, tied back her hair, and before she reported to the dress shop where she spent her days hemming gowns for women who would never learn her name, she made a small detour, a basket of bread and a fresh jar of honey tucked under her arm. She told herself it was only good manners. A woman does not help a stranger out of a ditch and then forget her the next morning. But some small, honest part of her already knew it was more than manners pulling her down that lane, and that whatever Agnes had left unfinished the night before, Elira was not going to be satisfied until she understood it. 3 weeks passed, and Elira kept her promise every single day. She learned Agnes's habits the way one learns the habits of a wild bird that visits the same windowsill each morning, slowly, and without ever quite being trusted. Agnes liked her tea strong and unsweetened. She refused help walking to the garden even when her ankle clearly still ached, though she allowed Elira to walk beside her, close enough to catch her if she stumbled, as long as no one called it help out loud. She asked sharp, testing questions, the kind meant to see whether Elira would flinch or lie or flatter her way out of an uncomfortable answer. "Why do you really come here every day?" Agnes asked one afternoon, while Elira mended a torn hem on an old shawl, needle flashing quick, and even in the light from the window. "You could be at that dress shop earning extra coin. You could be out chasing some young man of your own instead of an old woman's company." "I could be," Elira agreed, not looking up from her stitching. "I choose this instead." "That isn't an answer." "It's the only one I have." Elira bit off the thread and held the shawl up to check her work. "I like sitting here. You don't pretend to be anything you aren't, and most people I know spend all day pretending. It's restful, being around someone who doesn't bother." Agnes made a small sound in her throat that might have been amusement, or might have been something closer to surprise, and said nothing more on the subject that day. The dress shop, meanwhile, had grown louder and more frantic with each passing week, as the palace prepared for a second, grander ball, one where the Duke himself was expected to finally choose among the noble daughters who had been parading past him all season. Every gown in the shop needed letting out or taking in or restitching with fresh lace, and Elira's fingers were raw from the constant work. It was there, hunched over yet another hem, that she first heard Rosalind Ashworth's voice cut across the workroom like a blade drawn from its sheath. "You," Rosalind said, sweeping in with 2 attendants trailing behind her, her gown already half finished and clearly not good enough by her own estimation. "The seamstress girl. Fix this collar before tonight or I'll have you dismissed. I won't stand in front of the Duke looking like a shop girl myself." Elira kept her eyes down and her hands steady, because arguing with Rosalind Ashworth had never once ended well for anyone beneath her station, and there were still bills to pay and a roof that needed mending before winter. She took the collar without complaint, though something tight and familiar coiled in her stomach, the particular ache of being looked through rather than looked at. "You didn't attend either ball," Rosalind added, watching Elira work with the lazy cruelty of someone who enjoys knowing exactly where the weak point in a person lies. I heard the other girls talking. Elira Bennett, who could have gone, who had a dress and everything, and instead spent the evening playing nursemaid to some old beggar woman in the mud. How very noble of you. How very useless. Elira's needle did not slow. She isn't a beggar, she's a friend. A friend, Rosalind repeated, delighted, as though Elira had said something wonderfully foolish. How sweet. While the rest of us fight for a duke's hand, you found yourself a lonely old crone to keep house for. I do hope the reward is worth it. Elira said nothing further, because there was nothing to say that would not cost her more than it was worth, and Rosalind eventually grew bored and swept away again, attendants trailing after her like a wake behind a ship. But the word stayed lodged under Elira's ribs the rest of the day, and she walked to Agnes's cottage that evening with her jaw set tight and her thoughts louder than usual. She did not intend to mention any of it, but Agnes, sharp as ever, noticed the set of her shoulders the moment she walked through the door. "Someone was unkind to you today," Agnes said, not a question. "It doesn't matter. It matters enough that you're standing in my doorway like a soldier bracing for another blow. Sit down and tell me, or sit down and don't, but stop standing there like the wind might knock you over." Elira sat, and after a moment told her, not all of it, but enough, the collar, the sharp remarks, the word useless hanging in the air of the workroom long after Rosalind had gone. Agnes listened without interrupting, her pale gray eyes steady and unreadable, and when Elira finished, she reached over and patted her hand once briskly, the way one might pat a nervous horse rather than a grieving friend, but it steadied Elira all the same. "People like that girl," Agnes said, "measure their own worth by how small they can make everyone else feel. It is a poor way to live, though she will likely never learn that. Do not let her convince you that kindness is the same as weakness. The two have never once been the same thing, whatever fools like her believe." It was the most Agnes had ever said on any subject resembling comfort, and Elira found herself blinking back an unexpected sting behind her eyes, quickly hidden by busying her hands with the kettle. It was 3 days after that conversation when the stranger first appeared. Elira was walking home from the cottage later than usual, the sky already deepening toward evening, when she heard hurried footsteps and shouting break out somewhere behind her on the lane. She turned in time to see a runaway cart horse, its harness snapped loose, barreling straight down the narrow road with an empty cart clattering wildly behind it. No driver in sight, only chaos and the panicked whinny of the animal as it thundered toward a group of children playing near a well. There was no time to think. Elira ran toward the children, arms wide, shouting for them to move, and at the very same instant a man came sprinting from the opposite direction, plain-coated, hatless, moving with a speed and certainty that suggested he had done something like this before. Together, without a single word exchanged between them, they scattered the children out of the horse's path, Elira sweeping the smallest one up against her hip, while the stranger caught the loose end of the broken harness and hauled hard, throwing his whole weight backward until the horse's charge broke into a stumbling, furious halt. For a moment afterward, no one moved. The horse stood trembling, sides heaving, and the children clung to their mothers who had come running from nearby doorways, and Elira stood with her heart slamming against her ribs, staring at the man who had just helped her prevent what could have been a terrible accident. He was younger than she had first guessed, dark-haired, with calloused hands that did not quite match the fine cut of his plain coat, and eyes that studied her with an intensity that felt almost like recognition, though she was certain she had never seen him before in her life. "That was well done," he said, a little breathless, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Most people freeze faced with something like that. You didn't." "Neither did you," Elira pointed out, still catching her own breath, setting the small child down gently on her feet. "I've had practice." He said it simply, without elaborating, the way a person mentions something they would rather not explain in detail. "I'm called Callum." "Elira." She studied him a moment, curious despite herself. You're not from this end of town. I would have remembered a man who catches runaway horses for a living. I'm not from this end of town, he agreed, something almost like amusement flickering across his face. I was visiting someone nearby. I don't suppose you'd let me walk with you a while, given we've just survived a small disaster together. It seems the sort of thing that ought to be discussed properly, rather than left standing in the middle of a road. Alira should have said no. A sensible girl, mindful of her reputation and her limited free hours, would have thanked the stranger politely and gone on her way. But there had been something steady in the way he had moved toward danger without a moment's hesitation, the same instinct that had sent her running toward those children, and she found herself falling into step beside him instead, telling herself it was only for a little while, only until the next turning in the road. That little while stretched into an hour. They argued, almost immediately and almost happily, about whether onions belonged in a proper stew, about whether the palace's endless balls served any real purpose beyond wasting good candle wax, about whether courage was something a person was born with or something they built, piece by piece, out of every frightening moment they refused to run from. You have very strong opinions for someone I met 20 minutes ago while catching a runaway horse, Callum said at one point, clearly fighting a smile. You have very strong opinions for a stranger who invited himself to walk me home, Alira countered, and he laughed then, a real laugh, surprised out of him, as though it had been a long while since something had caught him so off guard. At her street corner he stopped, seeming reluctant to let the conversation end there. Might I walk with you again? Not tomorrow. I have obligations I can't easily set aside, but soon. Alira considered him a long moment, this odd, capable stranger with calloused hands and a coat too plain for hands like that, who argued about stew as though the fate of kingdoms rested on the outcome. Soon, she agreed. She did not tell Agnes about him that night, though she nearly did, the words hovering on the edge of her tongue while Agnes studied her with those same sharp, pale gray eyes across the low fire. Some things, Alira decided, were worth keeping to herself a little longer, worth turning over privately before she let anyone else, even someone as trusted as Agnes, have a say in what they meant. She did not yet notice, walking home that night with her thoughts full of stew arguments and a stranger's laugh, that Agnes's eyes and Callum's eyes were exactly the same shade of pale gray, or that such a small detail, if she had let herself notice it, might have told her everything she still did not know. Autumn deepened over the following weeks, and Callum kept his promise more faithfully than Alira had expected a stranger might. He appeared at odd hours, sometimes waiting near the dress shop as she finished her work, sometimes falling into step beside her on the lane as though he had simply materialized out of the evening mist. He never explained his comings and goings, never said where his obligations took him during the days he disappeared entirely, and Alira, strangely, found she did not mind the mystery as much as she probably should have. You ask a great many questions you never quite finish asking, Callum observed one evening, as they sat together on a low stone wall overlooking the river, the water dark and moving fast below them after days of rain further upstream. You give a great many answers that never quite answer anything, Alira replied, and he laughed, the same surprised laugh she had come to listen for. Fair, he admitted. I have my reasons. They are not interesting reasons. Mostly they involve people who would make my life very complicated if certain things about me were known too widely too soon. That sounds like the sort of sentence a debtor uses, Alira said, only half joking, or a criminal. Neither, I promise you. Simply a man with obligations heavier than he'd like and a family that watches him more closely than is entirely comfortable. He glanced sideways at her, something careful and searching in his expression. Does it trouble you that I can't tell you everything yet? Alira considered the question honestly before answering, because she had learned, in the weeks since the night of the runaway horse, that Callum noticed when her answers were merely polite rather than true, and seemed to prefer the true ones even when they were less comfortable. "It would trouble me," she said finally, "if I thought you were hiding something cruel. I don't think that. I think you're hiding something heavy, and there's a difference. I can wait for heavy things to be set down in their own time." Something shifted in his face then, quick and unguarded, gone almost before she could name it, and he reached over and took her hand, not with any grand declaration, simply holding it there on the cold stone wall between them, as though the gesture said more than any of his careful, unfinished sentences ever could. It was 2 nights later that the real danger came. Elira had stayed later than usual at Agnes's cottage, the two of them deep in an argument over whether the garden herbs needed pruning before the first hard frost, when a sudden pounding on the door interrupted them both. It was a boy from the dress shop, red-faced and out of breath, sent to fetch Elira because a fire had broken out in the storage room where the finest bolts of silk were kept, silk meant for the palace's grandest gowns, silk that represented months of the shop owner's savings and half the neighborhood's livelihood if it burned. Elira ran the whole way, skirts hitched up in both fists, and arrived to a scene already half chaos, smoke pouring from the shop's back windows, a bucket line forming raggedly along the street, shouted instructions crossing each other in the dark. The shop owner, an older woman named Beatrice who had given Elira her first position when no one else would, stood wringing her hands near the doorway, unable to go further in because the smoke had already grown too thick for her weak lungs to bear. "The ledger," Beatrice gasped, catching Elira's arm as she arrived. "The account books, the deeds to this building, they're all in the back office, and if they burn we lose everything, the shop, the roof over half our workers' heads, everything we have." Without stopping to think it through properly, Elira grabbed a wet cloth from the nearest bucket, pressed it over her mouth and nose, and pushed into the smoke-filled shop before anyone could stop her, ignoring the shouts behind her telling her to come back. The heat inside was immediate and disorienting, thick smoke curling along the ceiling, the crackle of flame somewhere close in the storage room beyond. Elira kept low, the way she had once heard a soldier describe surviving a burning building, and felt her way along the familiar shelves toward the small back office, coughing despite the wet cloth, eyes streaming. She found the ledger and the deed box exactly where Beatrice always kept them, but as she turned to leave, a support beam near the storage room doorway gave a sharp, groaning crack, and a section of the ceiling above it sagged dangerously, blocking the most direct path back toward the front door. For one terrible, spinning moment, Elira could not see any way through the smoke, could not tell which direction led to safety and which led deeper into the fire. Her lungs burned. The ledger felt suddenly very heavy in her arms. Then a hand closed around her wrist, firm and certain, and Callum's voice cut through the smoke close to her ear. "This way, move now, don't stop to think, just move." She had no idea how he had gotten inside, no idea how he had known where to find her in the chaos, and there was no time to ask. She followed the pull of his hand blindly, trusting him completely in a way that would have frightened her if she'd had breath left to consider it, ducking beneath a fallen shelf, stumbling once over debris she couldn't see, until suddenly cool night air hit her face and she was outside, gasping, the ledger and deed box still clutched to her chest. Callum's arm braced solid around her shoulders, holding her upright. The crowd erupted in relief around them. Beatrice wept openly, clutching the recovered ledger as though it were a lost child returned home. Someone pressed a cup of water into Elira's shaking hands, and through all of it, Callum stayed close beside her, his own face streaked with soot, checking her over with a kind of controlled urgency that made it clear how frightened he had actually been, however calm his voice had sounded inside the burning building. "You could have died in there," he said, once the worst of the crowd's attention had moved elsewhere, once the fire brigade had arrived to finish dousing the flames. His voice was low, rough with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but sat somewhere painfully close to both. "I know," Elira admitted, still trembling faintly from the smoke and the adrenaline both. I didn't think. Beatrice gave me my first work when no one else would look at me twice. I couldn't let it all burn while I stood outside wringing my hands. I understand that. Callum's hand found hers again, gripping tighter than usual. I understand it, and it terrifies me anyway. Promise me you won't run into a burning building again without at least shouting for help first. I'll try, Alira said, which was as much honesty as she could offer him in that moment, and something in his exhausted, soot-streaked expression told her he understood that too, and would take it for now. It was Rosalind Ashworth, of course, who arrived just late enough to witness the tail end of the rescue, and just early enough to see Callum's arms still wrapped protectively around Alira's shoulders as the crowd began to thin. "Well," Rosalind said, arriving with two of her attendants in tow, her sharp eyes moving over the scene with obvious calculation. "Isn't this interesting? The little seamstress and her mysterious rescuer. Tell me, sir, do you make a habit of running into burning buildings for shop girls you've only just met?" "I make a habit of helping anyone in danger," Callum said evenly, something cool entering his voice that Alira had not heard from him before, a tone that suggested he was well practiced in handling people like Rosalind, regardless of their station. Rosalind's gaze sharpened further, moving between the two of them with the particular hunger of someone who has just glimpsed a secret and intends to make full use of it. "How admirable," she said, though nothing in her tone suggested she found it admirable at all. "I do hope, Alira, that you know what you're playing at. Strange men who appear from nowhere and vanish just as easily rarely turn out to be what they seem." She swept away again before Alira could formulate a reply, and Alira felt the first cold thread of worry uncoil in her stomach, not for herself, but for the strange, careful way Callum's jaw had tightened at Rosalind's words, as though she had come closer to some hidden truth than she realized. "She doesn't like you," Callum observed once Rosalind was out of earshot, an attempt at lightness that did not quite land. "She doesn't like anyone who isn't useful to her," Alira said. "Don't let her trouble you. She's all sharp words and no real substance underneath." But Callum's expression stayed thoughtful and distant the rest of that evening, and when he finally walked Alira home, he was quieter than usual, his obligations, whatever they were, pressing more heavily on him than she had seen before. 3 days later, when Alira arrived at Agnes's cottage for her usual visit, she found the old woman slumped in her chair by the cold hearth, her breathing shallow and quick, her skin pale as candle wax, and every ordinary worry Alira had been carrying about Rosalind, about Callum's secrets, about the fire and its aftermath, vanished instantly beneath a single, overwhelming fear that left no room for anything else at all. Alira dropped to her knees beside the chair, pressing her fingers to Agnes's wrist the way she had that very first night in the storm, and found the pulse thin and racing beneath her fingertips. "Agnes," she said, keeping her voice steady though panic clawed up her throat. "Agnes, can you hear me?" Agnes's eyes fluttered half open, unfocused, her lips moving without sound, and Alira did not wait for a clearer answer. She ran to the door and shouted into the street for help, and by fortune or instinct, one of the neighbors recognized the urgency in her voice and sent a boy running for the nearest physician, while another fetched water and blankets. It was the longest quarter hour of Alira's life, kneeling beside Agnes, keeping her upright, murmuring the same steady reassurances her mother used to offer frightened patients, until the physician finally arrived, black bag in hand, and began his careful examination. But it was not the town physician who arrived first, it was Callum. He came through the cottage door at a dead run, coat unbuttoned, hair disheveled, his face draining of color the instant he saw Agnes slumped in the chair. He crossed the small room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees on her other side, taking her hand in both of his with a tenderness that told Alira, in one single unguarded instant, more than weeks of careful conversation ever had. "Grandmother," he said, and the word landed in the room like a struck bell. "Grandmother, stay with me." Alira went very still. For a moment she thought she had misheard him, that the fear and rush of the last quarter hour had confused her ears. But Agnes's eyes opened fully then, focusing on Callum's face with a fierce, unmistakable recognition, and Alira understood, all at once, with terrible clarity, exactly what she had somehow failed to see for weeks. The same pale gray eyes, the same sharp, unbending pride, the way certain neighbors had always gone quiet and careful whenever Agnes's name came up, the way the old woman had once said, "Whatever else you might one day hear," and let the sentence hang unfinished in the air. "You're her grandson," Alira said slowly, the words tasting strange and cold in her mouth. "You're the Duke." Callum's head came up, and whatever he saw in Alira's face made him flinch as though she had struck him. "Alira, I can explain." "Not now," she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended, though she could not seem to soften it. "Not while she needs us both focused on her and not on this." He nodded, jaw tight, and turned his full attention back to Agnes as the physician finally arrived and began his work in earnest, examining her heart, her breathing, murmuring instructions for broth and rest, and a tincture to be administered by the hour. Alira helped where she was needed, fetching water, holding Agnes steady while the physician listened to her chest, her hands moving with the same steady competence they always did in a crisis, even while everything underneath that steadiness had just cracked clean through. It was well past midnight before the physician finally declared Agnes stable enough to sleep, her condition serious but, with careful rest, not immediately fatal, a weakness of the heart that had likely been building quietly for months. Callum thanked him with a formality Alira had never heard in his voice before, the careful, measured tone of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, and it struck her, watching him, how easily the plain-coated stranger who argued about Stu had slipped away, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Once the physician had gone and Agnes lay sleeping fitfully in the next room, a maid summoned from the palace sitting watch beside her, Callum finally turned to face Alira properly, standing in the small kitchen where they had shared tea and argued and laughed for weeks, without either of them fully realizing how much the other had been keeping hidden. "I should have told you," he said before she could speak. "I meant to. Every single time I walked away from you, I told myself tomorrow, I'll tell her tomorrow, and then tomorrow came and I couldn't bear the thought of you looking at me differently once you knew. You let me believe you were an ordinary man," Alira said, her voice tight and quiet, more painful for its lack of shouting. "You let me argue with you about onions and stew and courage as though none of it mattered beyond the moment. And all the while you were testing me, weren't you? Watching to see whether I'd be kind to your grandmother without knowing who she was, without expecting a reward for it." "It wasn't like that," Callum said, though the flicker of guilt crossing his face suggested it had been, at least in part, exactly like that. "At first, perhaps, I wondered. There have been so many girls this season who smiled at me and were kind to everyone I introduced them to, and cold the instant they thought no one important was watching. I wanted to know if you were different before I let myself hope you might be. But Alira, that isn't why I kept coming back. I kept coming back because I liked you. Because arguing with you about Stu was the first honest conversation I'd had in years that wasn't shaped by my title." "That may be true," Alira said, and it was, she could see it in his face, could feel the truth of it even through her own hurt. "But it doesn't change that you deceived me. That every single time I told you something honest about myself, you were holding something enormous back, deciding for both of us when I was ready to know it." "I'm sorry." He said it simply, without excuse layered on top of it, and for a moment Alira almost let herself soften, almost let herself remember the way his hand had found hers on the cold stone wall above the river. But the hurt was still too fresh, too tangled up with fear for Agnes, and the sudden vertigo of learning that half of what she thought she understood about the last several weeks had been incomplete. "I need to go home," she said instead. "I need to think. Please don't follow me tonight." Something closed in his expression, quiet and resigned, and he stepped back to let her pass without another word, though his eyes followed her all the way to the door, full of things he clearly wanted to say and knew, for once, not to. Alira walked home through the dark streets alone, her mind spinning through every conversation, every argument, every laugh she had shared with Callum, searching each memory now for signs of the deception she had somehow missed entirely. She found none that felt cruel. That was, perhaps, the most confusing part of all. Everything he had said to her had felt true in the moment, and yet the largest truth of all had been kept from her completely. News of the Duke's connection to the injured old woman in the poorer end of town spread through the palace within a single day, as such things always seemed to, and it was Rosalind Ashworth, predictably, who made the most of it, whispering to anyone who would listen that the little seamstress girl had been playing a far longer game than anyone realized, cozying up to the Duke's own grandmother in order to secure his favor through the back door, since she clearly had no hope of winning it honestly at any ball. The rumor reached Alira at the dress shop 2 days later, delivered with poorly disguised glee by one of the other seamstresses, and it landed like a physical blow. Beatrice, to her credit, dismissed it instantly as nonsense, having seen with her own eyes how Alira had run into a burning building for no reward at all. But not everyone in town was so quick to disbelieve a story with a duke and a scheming shop girl at its center. Alira did not go back to the cottage for 4 days. She told herself it was because she needed time, and that was true, but underneath the reasonable explanation sat a rower, more frightened one, the fear that if she went back, she would see Callum there again, and she was not yet certain whether she was angrier at him or simply afraid of how much she had missed him in so short a time. It was Agnes, finally, who ended the silence, sending a message through the same neighbor's boy who had first fetched Alira into the storm all those weeks ago. The message was short, written in a hand that was clearly still weak from illness but stubborn all the same. "Come see an old woman who is tired of being lied to about why you've stopped visiting. Bring no explanations, just come." Alira read it twice, felt something in her chest loosen slightly for the first time in 4 days, and set down the gown she had been mending to make the walk to the cottage she had once thought belonged to nobody more important than a sharp-tongued old woman with a garden full of untrimmed herbs. She had no way of knowing, walking that familiar lane one more time, that the conversation waiting for her inside would change the shape of everything that followed, or that Agnes Whitmore, weakened by illness but far from finished, had already begun quietly setting a plan into motion that neither Rosalind Ashworth nor the whole of the palace's watching court would see coming. Agnes was sitting up when Alira arrived, propped against a stack of pillows in her narrow bed, still pale but with color returning to her cheeks, and more tellingly, with the same sharp light back in her pale gray eyes that had been missing the night of her collapse. "You look terrible," Agnes said by way of greeting, which from her was as close to affection as most conversations began. "Sit down before you fall down. I've been told secondhand that you've spent 4 days looking like someone stepped on your favorite plant." "I've been busy," Alira said, taking the chair beside the bed, though the excuse sounded thin even to her own ears. "You've been sulking," Agnes corrected, not unkindly. "Which is your right, given what my grandson did, but I did not summon you here to discuss his failings. He is perfectly capable of failing on his own without my assistance. I summoned you here because I owe you an explanation of my own, and because I am tired, weak heart or not, of watching 2 stubborn people avoid a conversation neither of them can stop thinking about." Alira opened her mouth to protest and found she had nothing convincing to say, because Agnes was, as usual, entirely correct. "I was not entirely honest with you either," Agnes continued, folding her thin hands over the blanket. I let you believe I was simply a lonely old woman with no one to check on her. And while that much was true enough, I did not tell you that my grandson had asked me, before that storm ever came, to help him understand which of this season's young women might be worth his real attention rather than his titles. He suspected, correctly as it turns out, that most of them were performing kindness for an audience they believed was watching. I agreed to help him find out, mostly because I was curious myself, and partly, I admit, because I was tired of watching him be courted by girls who saw a crown before they ever saw a man. So I was a test, Alira said quietly, the old hurt rising fresh again, from the very first night. You were not a test that night, Agnes said firmly, her voice gaining strength as though the correction mattered to her more than her own weakened heart should have allowed. That night, girl, I was simply an old woman who had fallen in the mud, and you were simply a stranger who stopped to help me when every other soul on that road was rushing toward a ballroom. I did not plan that. Neither did Callum. It was only afterward, once he learned who had helped me and asked to meet you properly, that the rest of it became something closer to a test. And even then, I do not think he ever fully separated the testing from the simple, foolish fact that he liked you far too much to keep his distance the way he'd intended. Alira sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, feeling the sharp edges of her hurt soften slightly, though not disappear entirely. That doesn't erase the deception. He should have told me the truth himself, the moment he realized his feelings had become more than an experiment. He should have, Agnes agreed without hesitation. I have told him as much myself, in considerably less patient terms than I am using with you. He is a good man, Alira, better than most who wear a title as heavy as his, but he is also a man who has spent his entire life being courted for his position rather than his character, and it has made him cautious in ways that sometimes tip over into cowardice. That is not an excuse. It is simply an explanation, and explanations are worth less than actions, which is why I am not asking you to forgive him tonight, or tomorrow, or on any particular schedule at all. I am only asking you to hear him out properly, when you are ready, rather than deciding everything based on one difficult evening. Before Alira could answer, a soft knock sounded at the cottage door and her stomach dropped, certain she knew who stood on the other side of it. But when Agnes called for the visitor to enter, it was not Callum who stepped through the doorway. It was a palace messenger, formally dressed, carrying a sealed letter bearing the Duke's own crest. For Miss Alira Bennet, the messenger said, bowing slightly before extending the letter, and then, at Agnes's brisk wave of dismissal, retreating back out into the evening without another word. Alira turned the letter over in her hands, the wax seal cool and heavy beneath her fingers, and looked up to find Agnes watching her with an expression that was trying, not entirely successfully, to look innocent of any involvement in its arrival. "Open it," Agnes said. "Whatever it says, you deserve to hear it from him directly, even if he's chosen paper over his own voice because he's a coward about certain things. As I've already told you." Alira broke the seal carefully. Inside, in handwriting she now recognized from the note that had once been slipped beneath a shop door inviting her to walk along the river, Callum had written only a few lines. "I understand if you never wish to see me again, and I will respect that choice completely. But there is to be a gathering at the palace 3 nights from now, and I intend to stand before the whole court and tell them the truth about how I met the only woman this season who never once asked me for anything at all. I would rather you hear it from me in person than through rumor, but if you cannot bring yourself to come, know that I will say it regardless, because it is the truth, and you deserve to have it spoken honestly, whether or not you choose to forgive the dishonesty that came before it." Alira read the letter twice, then set it carefully in her lap, aware of Agnes watching her with poorly hidden curiosity. "Well," Agnes said, "what does the coward have to say for himself?" "He's going to tell the whole court the truth," Alira said slowly, still absorbing it, "whether I come or not." That sounds, Agnes said, settling back against her pillows with the satisfied air of someone whose plan, however indirect, was finally bearing fruit. Like exactly the kind of foolish, stubborn, entirely correct thing my grandson would do. 3 nights later, the palace ballroom blazed with candlelight exactly as it had the night of the storm, months earlier, when Alira had turned away from that light to help a stranger in a ditch instead. This time she walked toward it, dressed not in the gown she had once hoped might get her through the doors as a guest, but in a simple, well-made dress of deep blue that Beatrice herself had insisted on finishing by hand, refusing payment, calling it the least she owed the girl who had once run into a burning building to save her livelihood. The ballroom fell into uneven, whispering silence as Alira entered, the assembled nobility clearly recognizing her from the rumors Rosalind had so eagerly spread, though not one of them seemed to know quite what to make of her presence there tonight. Rosalind herself stood near the front of the room in a gown of gold and cream, her expression sharpening into something close to alarm as she registered exactly who had just walked through the doors. Callum stood near the raised dais at the room's far end, and the moment his eyes found Alira across the crowded floor, every careful, formal composure he had been holding seemed to falter, relief and hope and lingering guilt all crossing his face at once before he mastered himself enough to address the room. "Many of you have heard rumors this past week," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, "about a young woman from the poorer end of town, and about my grandmother, and about a supposed scheme meant to secure my favor through deception. I would like to correct those rumors tonight plainly before they grow any larger." He told them the truth, all of it, without softening the parts that made him look foolish. He told them of the storm, and the old woman fallen in a ditch while every other eligible daughter in the kingdom rushed toward this very ballroom. He told them of the weeks that followed, of a young seamstress who visited a lonely old woman every single day expecting nothing in return, who never once asked who she was helping or what it might earn her. He told them of a runaway horse and a burning dress shop, and an argument about onions that had somehow become the most honest conversation he'd had in years. "I did not tell her who I was," he admitted, and a ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the crowd. "I let her believe I was simply a man because I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything, to know whether her kindness would survive contact with the truth of my title, or whether it had only ever been performed for people she thought might reward her for it. It was unfair of me. I have told her as much, and I will go on telling her, for as long as she'll allow me the chance, because the truth is this. Every eligible daughter in this kingdom spent this entire season chasing after me. Only one of them was too busy helping someone who could give her nothing at all to notice I existed. That is the woman I choose if she will still have me, knowing everything now that she did not know then." The ballroom erupted into a confusion of whispers and gasps, and Rosalind's face had gone pale and furious in equal measure. But Alira barely registered any of it, her whole attention fixed on Callum as he stepped down from the dais and crossed the ballroom floor toward her, ignoring the parting crowd entirely. "I meant every word of that," he said quietly, once he stood close enough that only she could hear him properly. "I know an apology in front of a crowded room doesn't erase 4 days of you avoiding me, or weeks of me not telling you something I should have said the very first time I realized how much I liked arguing with you about Stu. But I wanted you to hear it plainly, from me, in front of everyone, so there could be no more rumors, no more Rosalind Ashworth deciding what story gets told about you. Only the true one." Alira studied him a long moment, the ballroom and its whispering crowd fading into something distant and unimportant around them, and thought of the ditch in the storm, and the fire, and the cold stone wall above the river where he had first taken her hand without any grand declaration at all, simply because the gesture had felt true. "I'm still angry with you," she said finally, and watched something flicker with worry across his face before she continued. But I've decided that being angry and still wanting to stand here talking to you aren't actually opposites. My mother used to say the two things could live in the same room together if a person was patient enough to let them. Your mother sounds like she was a very wise woman, Callum said, something like hope breaking cautiously across his expression. She was, Alira agreed. I think she would have liked you, eventually, once she'd finished being thoroughly unimpressed with the way you introduced yourself. Agnes, watching from a chair near the dais where she had insisted on being carried despite her physician's objections, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile at the sight of the two of them standing close together amid the wreckage of Rosalind's carefully spread rumors, and thought, not for the first time, that she had chosen rather well, that stormy night in the mud, even if she hadn't fully realized at the time exactly what she was choosing. The gossip took weeks to fully settle, as gossip always does, and Rosalind Ashworth never did manage to recover the standing she had enjoyed before that night. Her own unkindness laid bare beside Alira's quiet, unrewarded generosity for the whole court to compare at their leisure. But Alira found she cared very little about any of that, in the end. She was too busy most evenings, walking the familiar lane toward a narrow cottage with an overgrown herb garden, sometimes alone, sometimes with Callum falling into step beside her, still arguing about Stu, still laughing at nothing in particular, still choosing, every single day, to knock on that same door. Agnes lived to see the wedding, seated in the front row in a chair she still refused to admit she needed, and when the ceremony ended and the new Duchess of Hartley Hall turned to face the cheering crowd, her first instinct, before the applause had even fully died away, was to look for the old woman who had once told her, in a cold cottage lit only by a low fire, that kindness and stubbornness had never once been opposites, whatever anyone else believed. She found Agnes watching her with those same pale gray eyes, sharp and proud and for once entirely unguarded, and understood in that quiet moment above the noise of the celebrating crowd that she had never once been chasing a duke at all. She had simply stopped, one stormy night, to help someone who needed it, and everything good that followed had grown, slowly and honestly, out of that single choice.